Harrison portray Raymond as like the student of the future for CPSX. He is jointly supervised between someone in engineering and science. He's technically based out of engineering, but kind of bringing together science and engineering to look at interesting topics. And yeah, without further ado, he's going to take us outside of North America. So hopefully there'll be a lot of new stuff in here and looking at space programs that is not NASA, not CSA. Probably not much ESO either, I'm guessing. Actually, maybe. Anyway, take it away, Raymond.
Great, so yeah, I'm working with odds and also somebody in engineering, and mostly, I guess, laser beams and blue-green men. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about, this is a talk actually I gave at the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada a little over a year ago, updating it a bit. The idea is to explore the idea of space programs outside of North America. We live in a time when space is important to modern society, and space is well known to people. People know that things are happening in space. But the general public, and even sometimes those of us in this community, have maybe sometimes sort of centric impressions about who's doing what in space. And certainly for the public, NASA has the highest profile. Everybody knows that NASA exists, even if they don't know exactly what it does. And there's some couple of images that resonate most with what's going on. And that's probably true here even in Canada, where we have our own Canadian Space Agency who do some things, and the public probably doesn't know about it. I'm not going to talk about CSA though, because hopefully everybody here knows about it. And that's a whole other talk. And I'm not going to talk very much about NASA either, because they've had their wind in the face again and again. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to give a comprehensive and a complete and exhaustive overview of every space program out there, because eventually you'll realize that there are too many to list, let alone describe. There are countries today doing space at all kinds of levels, for all kinds of reasons, and with programs that are mature and young, programs that are big and small. I'm going to take 3 examples to make a kind of cross-section. Very large and established programs, small and new, and somewhere in between. And then I will take one example in detail and look at their programs at a kind of finer level. And I don't know if this is to the disappointment of others or not, but it's the one that I know best that I'm going to do in detail. So anyway, we're going to start with that, and I'll start by telling you everything that you already know about the history of space exploration. As far as I was concerned, it all started back in the 50s. The Soviets tossed this thing into orbit, and Sputnik 1 didn't do much except send out some little radio beeps, but it did it by orbiting the Earth, and that was enough to touch things off. It was a day of superpowers and rockets and nuclear bombs and mutually assured destruction, and so we had this race between the big superpowers, and each of them building bigger and bigger rockets and bigger bombs to threaten each other and to make some kind of dominance on the surface of the planet. And as a kind of sidebar, Oneupmanship game, they could have these one feat after another where they're trying to do more and more impressive things in space. First a little ball of steel, and then a dog, and then a monkey, and then a man, and then 2 men, and then on and on and on, and they one-up each other for a while until this finally happens. Somebody stands on the moon, they take this picture, and then nothing else happens. Probably this is still resonating in this public image today. Meanwhile, nobody else was doing anything, just sitting by, waiting for the superpowers to do their thing. Or maybe not. As early as 1962, a handful of other countries are collaborating with one or more of the superpowers to have their own spacecraft launched. Some of them, like Canada, are designing their own spacecraft indigenously, but asking the US for launch services. Others are partnering with development. So in some cases, they're actually built and designed in the United States, but controlled from a domestic radio station. By 1965, a third country develops indigenous launch capability. France sends Astérix into orbit. It's named after the cartoon character. And like the cartoon character, it doesn't do much very useful. Its job is just to characterize the launch vehicle. So it just has some accelerometers and some other sensors and enough antennas to beam that stuff back. Now, it's expensive to develop launch vehicles, so it's not only France that's trying to do it, but France looks for some partners to help pay for the project. So by the end of the 1960s, several European countries have banded together to form the European Launcher Development Organization. And they designed this beautiful rocket called Europa, and they launch it 5 times. And each of the 5 times it is a complete failure, which puts some stress on the relationship and almost brings the whole project to an end. But nonetheless, somebody's trying. There are some other countries, there's about 8 of them in that organization, that are working to do space stuff, even before the space race comes to its conclusion. And it's not all happening in Europe. On the other side of the planet, Japan develops their own indigenous launch vehicle, and they launch their own satellite into orbit. Osumi is named after the province from which it was launched, and it succeeds in taking ionospheric readings for half a day. Ionospheric readings were really popular at the time. We didn't know the ionosphere very well. People were trying to figure out how it works. This thing overheated and coughed out. A little bit better, just a few weeks later, China launches Dongfang Hong-1 on their own rocket. Now we're up to 5 countries with indigenous launch capability, and it's just the end of the 1960s. It takes ionospheric readings, similar to the ones from Japan, but it does it for a month. But more importantly, it broadcasts a patriotic song. Dongfang Hong, I'm told, is Chinese for the East is red. And it apparently, and I don't speak Chinese and I can read Chinese, but apparently it makes an illusion between the glowing red of sunset and the glowing enlightenment of the red communist thing starting in the eastern part of Asia. Anyway, it broadcast that down at the surface of the earth for everybody to hear. And so rounds up the 1960s. For the rest of, well, into the 1970s, these countries that are listed here, all of them expand their space programs. They build more satellites, they find more collaborations, they expand into new realms of activity, and new actors come in that are not yet mentioned here. Fast forward to today, and there are so many countries that I can't list them all on one slide. Not as many as there are people in this sort of big business convention in Paris, but enough that space has become highly diverse. There are numerous countries with national space programs, and numerous countries that host space industries, some of them without even having a space agency. There's a list here just of the countries with launch capability. These are just the ones that are able to launch their own spacecraft, or even launch somebody else's, and a lot of them actually sell launch slots. Commercial launches become a big thing. And that's, when we talk about big business, some of these launches cost $200 million each. So now let's talk about where do we stand today with countries doing space programs. And like I said, I'm not going to be able to go through all of them, but I'll give 3 examples. A very established program that's been around for a while and has a broad diversity of programs. A very new player, and somebody in between. So first off, everybody knows that Russia has a space program. But maybe it's kind of quiet and we don't know what to do. These pictures are things that you've probably seen before. This is all stuff that they inherited from the Soviet program. A very successful space race player left behind all of this infrastructure for the Russians to use. The Soyuz launch vehicle on the right has flown almost 1,800 times, making it the most experienced launch vehicle on Earth. 1,800 times. It also has done that successfully about 97% of the time, making it the most reliable launch vehicle. Think about that. It means all the other ones fail more than 3% of the time. Anyway, it comes with the Soyuz spacecraft and its Progress cargo version, which are basically the backbone of transportation to the ISS, particularly when the space shuttle is in orbit, which is sometimes in the past and all the time starting really soon. They did a lot of work in the Soviet days with space stations and long-duration space flight, and that's left them with the ability to build the core elements of the ISS and similar programs. What you're seeing here in the bottom left is the ISS as it stood very, very early on in construction, about 10 years ago. On the right is a small American connecting node, node 1. Everything else is Russian. And these are actually the core elements from which the station is today built around and controlled and flown. One thing they didn't inherit from the Soviet Union was a penchant for business. But they've gotten into it in a big way in the last 20 years. They're a major player in commercial launch services. They sell launches on Soyuz and on other vehicles. And they sell launches for people too, and make more money than anybody else in space tourism. But enough about the past. There's been a lot of talk in Russia about trying to rebuild, partly for prestige, for other reasons, partly for utility, new reinvestment in the space program. You can always believe it when the president says something at the UN, right? This is what he had to say 3 years ago. That Russia had the chance to move from exploiting old Soviet infrastructure and develop some new ambitious programs for space. Well, maybe. What have they done since then? Well, in the last 3 years, they've been launching new space station modules of new design, not stuff that's entirely inherited from Mir. They've upgraded the Soyuz spacecraft. They've rebuilt and expanded and improved their navigation satellite system, GMAS, returning it, I think almost now, to global coverage, where it shrank just to sort of relation capability. There's another more recent and potentially very important development, which is that they're building a new launch site for Soyuz and other vehicles. Vostokny Cosmodrome. Now, not because it's in a town called Vostokny. Vostokny is an adjective for eastern. They started construction officially 2 days ago. This is a picture of Vladimir Putin and his band of guys here at the official opening and looking at a plan for the Cosmodrome. This is supposed to have its first launch in 2015, with manned launches starting in 2018. 82 billion rubles sounds like a lot. I guess they can get away with about $3 billion by 2020 when everything is all finalized. The thing is, why would they bother with this? They already have Baikonur down here in Kazakhstan, there, and Plesetsk, which is up here someplace in northern Russia, both of which can launch Soyuz. Plus, they've got a bunch of other sites from which they can send their converted missiles and whatever else they've got. Why bother? Well, first of all, Baikonur was built about as far south as you can go in the Soviet Union. But Kazakhstan isn't part of the Soviet Union anymore, and so now Russia has to spend 100 million rubles a year renting the place. And a few years ago, a Soyuz vehicle had a first booster stage failure, and it fell on the big mess in Kazakhstan. The Kazakh government has been giving Russia a hassle over that. So it's pretty inconvenient. Yeah, you know, it's a real mess to have rocket fuel all over the place. So to avoid these problems, you can come and do your own thing. So Putin again, talking just this week at a meeting of his, the government presidium turns out to be apparently just a council of the ruling party. They're starting to blur lines again between which is the party and which is the government. But they talk about becoming a truly self-sufficient space power. They don't have to depend on Baikonur anymore, and they don't have to depend on somebody else. They want to launch their cargo spacecraft, their space station modules, and manned flights. All the stuff they do at Baikonur, they want to move over to, some to Plesetsk, but mostly to the eastern launch site. And they explicitly talk about using this for missions to the moon and Mars. And again, you know, when presidents say things, and this is a prime minister now, but when prime ministers say things, we'll see. Believe it when we see it, right? But in any case, this is how this is targeted. Now, there's a bit more to it than that, though, because you already have Plesetsk. Right? You could still launch things from there. And it's nice to have something in the south, and this launch site here is fairly south down. But nonetheless, if you're going to build a new cosmodrome, why would you put it way the heck out here in the east? Because nobody lives here. And the space industry is over here in Samara and in Moscow and other places. That's a long way to go. So why put it way the heck out there? Domestic politics also plays a role. The population of Russia's Far East is declining. Russians who live there are migrating back west. They've been doing this for a while. And at the same time, let's go back to that map again. That's only 100 kilometers from the border with China. This is a part of Russia where there are very few Russians living anymore, but more and more migrants coming from very crowded China into empty Eastern Russia. And Russia is interested in fostering the development in the Far East, which you can take as code for cementing a bit their political influence in the region. So for Russia then, besides the obvious utility, we don't need to talk about how useful satellite navigation and Earth observation and whatever else are. Besides the utility of space programs, there's a pride, but there's also a political, a social, and an economic aspect to building spaceports and to running a space program. So for a big and established country with a very mature space industry, sometimes these considerations are as big as anything else. So that's example one, the big established country. Now we'll talk about the sort of middling, younger, but with some experience program, like India. They're a little bit newer. They weren't mentioned back in the black slides at the start because they hadn't got anything in by the end of the 60s. But they started out by cooperating. And back in the 70s, you know, if you weren't very closely aligned with the West or very closely aligned with the East, you could kind of put your finger in whatever pie you wanted, and they did. So they were cooperating with the Soviets first to launch in 1975, and with the Americans and with the Europeans who already had a fairly mature program at this point. By the end of the 1970s, they were able to launch their own spacecraft on rockets like the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, seen here. They're also really interested in commercializing their stuff, and so now they sell launches on PSLV. And actually, PSLV holds the record for the most spacecraft launched on a single rocket at one time. 9 of them in April of 07, all at once. 9 spacecraft, they're just putting off the springs and the rest. Really. They've got 50 of their own spacecraft launched, and they have plans to grow now into regions that have traditionally been a place for more established space powers. They want to do planetary exploration. They've already sent something to the moon. They have plans for a microgravity science facility, sort of an unmanned capsule where they could do weightlessness experiments, and even maybe offer that capacity out to other countries who don't have that capability. And they're building a human spacecraft, supposed to launch from this Satish Dhawan Space Center in a few years. That's again, you know, everything in space is a fantasy until it's in orbit and giving data. So we'll see when that comes. But there's a reasonable question: why does India do these things? We might not have, you know, 1 billion people living in India. They don't all live in the space age, perhaps. So why do this? And there's this famous engineer who's famous in India at least, Dr. Sarabhan. They call him the father of the Indian space program, and he addressed this question a couple decades ago. He said, "There are some who question the relevance of space activities in a developing nation. But for India, they're convinced that if they want to play a meaningful role at the national and at the international level, they have to be second to none in the application of advanced technologies to real problems in society." They see space as a way, first, of boosting economic growth, but second, of using the technologies and the development that come from that to transform their society. If they have Earth-observing satellites, if they have weather satellites, they can tell where the monsoons are going to come and when. They can tell where the crops will succeed and fail. They can provide telecommunications across a large and rugged country where it doesn't make economic sense to send copper wires to the homes of 1 billion people. And you can send one spacecraft to Geo. Now, we've heard this question here in Canada, too. Why are we spending money in space when we have problems on Earth? Why don't we feed all those starving people in Africa and then launch some rocket to the moon? And people who ask you that question may not be aware that there are space agencies and space programs in Africa. Why are the Africans doing this? Now, you notice not every country in Africa. These are some of the best funded, maybe best organized countries in Africa. But a decade and a half now that they've been having these programs. As far as I know, the first one launched was in 2000, but it takes a little time to develop. For the most part, they do this by cooperation with international partners. None of them has launch capability in Africa. But some of them have the ability to indigenously design satellites. This Sunsat here was developed at a university in South Africa. On the other hand, one of the more operational Earth-observing satellites for South Africa was built in Britain. So they cooperate where they can and where they need to. Nigeria Sat-1, cleverly named, first sat from Nigeria, was launched by the Chinese. African countries are going to cooperate with whoever they want to, and wherever they need to, and where they can find it. Another aspect is that even where they don't have space programs of their own, even where they don't have space capability at all, space is still important to them. Numerous countries in Africa are partnered with and have activated the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters. And if you're not familiar with that one, this was set up just over 10 years ago by the European, French, and Canadian space agencies as a way of sharing Earth-observing data in emergencies with the affected places. So for example, a year ago, there was a major earthquake in Haiti. Within hours, Earth-observing satellites from a half a dozen space agencies have been tasked, put aside their normal schedule, and they're tasked to take pictures of Haiti for use in building disaster response maps, comparing post to pre-disaster imagery to figure out what has changed and what has collapsed and what roads are closed. These kinds of things have been activated several times in Africa. So Africa benefits from space programs even when they don't launch them. So if you want to feed starving Africans, if you want to aid development in places like Africa, space is a way to do that. And so there's an excuse for countries like this to have space programs. Anyway, here's a kind of cross-section then. From the very big and the very old to the very small and the very young. There are dozens of countries with space programs, and they all fall somewhere in that spectrum somehow. And I can't, again, look at them all in detail in this talk. But I can look in detail at one that I know reasonably well. In Europe, many of these countries are well organized and well funded, and they have national programs. But they also participate jointly in the European Space Agency. ESA was set up by combining that European Launcher Development Organization with a space research entity in the beginning of the 1970s. It's established by international treaty, and it's unique that way. Most space agencies are national entities. In Canada, it's just the Department of the Ministry of Industry. But here, it's an international treaty organization, organized a bit like NATO or something. Headquartered in Paris, they have facilities throughout Europe to do different things. Mission control is mostly done from Germany. The way they fund this is part of the reason that this program I'm going to talk about later are successful. First off, member states pay into the agency's budget in proportion to their GDP. So if you're going to join, that's sort of the deal. Whatever the program level is funded at, everybody pays in proportionally. But that's only true for the mandatory programs. States can opt in to the optional programs, and we'll talk about what those are, as they see fit. The only country outside of Europe that has access to those programs is Canada. And the reason for restricting it, first of all, is because part of the reason the agency exists is not only to undertake space missions, but to develop the space industry in the member states. So those states that pay in are entitled to what's called the geo-return, a proportional industrial return on the contracts. When they issue out contracts, they divide them up by country to be kind of fair. Canada, at the end of the 1970s, signed a cooperation agreement with ESA that allows us to participate in the same way as a member state. And so we're entitled to geo-return as well. It gives access for our scientists, for our industry, for our government programs. So if you're not taking part in the ESA program and you're doing space science, you're missing out on a program that's bigger than ours that we have the right to take part in. The model with Canada was expanded after the Iron Curtain came down to Eastern Europe. So there are several states over here in gray that are part of the program for European cooperating states. And there, they're using that funding model to grow the industries in the Eastern countries. A lot of the countries in Eastern Europe don't have space industries that are developed enough that they could take part in the geo-return program. They wouldn't be able to get enough contracts to have their fair share. So they're sort of groomed and raised up to that level over some years. And two countries have already graduated from PECS, the European Cooperation State Program. Czech Republic in November 2008, and just last week, Romania Romania ratified the ESA Convention, and so will become the 19th member state pretty soon. So that's a lot of really boring talk about funding and international agreements and whatever, but it lays the groundwork for what comes next. I said that the mandatory programs, everybody had to pay into the mandatory programs proportionally. There are only two mandatory programs. The general budget, which is infrastructure and salaries and facilities, and space science. So not only is space science very well funded relative to other programs and relative to other places, but it's also relatively secure because that space science funding is locked in for at least 3 years. You can't have an election in one European state and have the space program, the science budget cut. Space science in Europe includes space astronomy, and this is a list of European projects which are currently in orbit or currently under construction. I've left off 3 decades worth of work that's already done. The Hubble Space Telescope. Everybody knows about NASA launching that thing. Not everybody knows that it was funded at 15% by ESA, and that the Space Telescope Science Institute is staffed at 15% by ESA, and that they contributed some of the instruments and some of the hardware. That relationship has led to the James Webb Successor Telescope, and Canada is going for that one as well, launched in 2013. Exclusively European projects include an X-ray lab called XMN Newton, the International Gamma Ray Astronomical Laboratory. Both of these have been up for, on the scale of a decade. Just 2 years ago, a pair of spacecraft, Herschel and Planck. Herschel is an infrared observatory, carries the largest mirror ever launched into space, bigger than Hubble. And Planck is a all-sky microwave mapper to give the highest resolution yet look at the cosmic background radiation. Both Herschel and Planck have Canadian participation. Gaia is a follow-on to this Hipparcos mission, and I don't know if we have any astronomers in the room today, but astronomers are pretty familiar with Hipparcos and the star catalog that came out of this. The ability to have 100,000 stars to milli-arc-second accuracy completely changed the way that people point telescopes. Gaia will take 1 billion stars to micro-arc-second accuracy. And the 1 billion pixel camera that they're going to put on this is going to be launched into some Lissajous orbit in 2012. This thing is worth a bit of a digression. Every star to magnitude 20, which is very faint, and you're looking at basically this whole half of the Milky Way, and some nearby bits of the Magellanic Clouds. Space science also includes the solar system, which includes a program for solar and magnetospheric physics that I won't get into, and planetary exploration. People in this room are probably very familiar with Mars Express, Venus Express, which carries almost the same instruments on almost the same spacecraft. The Titan lander, Huygens, the first time anybody put a probe on the surface of the moon of another planet. Back in the 80s, they were the closest ever flyby of a comet. And a lot of what we know about the makeup of comets came from Giotto. They're going to follow that up with Rosetta, which is already on its way to this comet Tridium Algernon, which will not only fly by the comet, but will enter into orbit and deploy a lander, coming 2014. Now we talk about offshore programs beyond space science. Earth observation is a major thrust of what they do. This is something that's very easy to sell to the public, and it has a very obvious utility. And so Earth observation is very well funded. Among the programs that they launched are the Earth Explorers. These are newer, smaller, and specialized spacecraft. They used to launch these big 8.5-ton polyvalent sort of spacecraft that had a dozen instruments. These are specialized. Goche, been in orbit for 2 years. The Gravity Field and Steady State Ocean Circulation Explorer is intended to provide a new map of the Earth's gravity field to higher resolution than ever before. We're talking 6 significant figures. But to do that, it carries a gradiometer that's not only sensitive, but very close to the surface of the Earth. This is a kind of realistic view, actually. So low, at less than 200 kilometers, that it's within the Earth's atmosphere and needs continuous propulsion to stay up. And it has to be aerodynamically shaped to pass through the atmosphere. Anyway, it's in orbit and it's working very well. They've also launched a mission for soil moisture and ocean salinity, and cryosat, which was just last year, yep, which is an attempt to measure the thickness and therefore the total amount of the Earth's ice sheets. Two more missions that are in development are going to look at atmospheric dynamics and clouds, aerosols, and the radiation budget. All of these things are key elements in understanding the Earth's climate system. Most of these are missing variables. The gravity field is needed to understand the baseline of ocean circulation so that you can put it together with the ocean salinity and figure out exactly what is going on in the thermohaline circulation in the oceans. And from that, then you can feed that back into climate models. That's all driven by this. This isn't weather satellites. They have a whole other system for that. Now, it's not much fun to have satellites if you don't have a way to put them there. They've been developing launchers since Eldo, and Europa may have failed, but Ariane has been very successful. Ariane 5 is now the dominant player in the world's commercial launch market, particularly with geostationary orbiting spacecraft. 10 tons to GTO is unsurpassed for commercial launches, and 20 tons to LEO for things like ISS servicing is also out of the league or some other thing. This is more than the space shuttle, by the way, can put into orbit. It can only do about 17 tons. This year, we'll see, or should see, the first launch of 2 new launch vehicles from the same facility in French Guiana. Vega is a small launcher, mostly for scientific and Earth-observing payloads, looking at about 1.5 tons to a sun-synchronous orbit. And Soyuz, an upgraded version of the Russian launcher, will, through cooperation with Russia, be launched from the same facility. Launching it from here instead of Baikonur, which is at 45 north or so, launching it from 4 degrees north, almost doubles its payload capacity to LEO, to GTO for that matter. You can't mention the optional programs when we're talking about human spaceflight, and I certainly can't avoid it because I used to work in ESA's ISS program. An important partner in the ISS, they contributed a science laboratory called Columbus, the automated transfer vehicle, which carries 7.5 tons of cargo to the space station, autonomously navigates to the station, autonomously docks, and can be used to reboost and control the station's orbit. So when they do debris avoidance maneuvers, they don't have to use the thrusters on the Zvezda anymore. They can use the more powerful ones on ATV. Two connecting and infrastructure nodes, and the segment, the computers for the Russian segment, all contributed by Lua. Now, ESA is not an institution of the European Union. It's sometimes confused as such. ESA has 18 to 19 member states, but they're different than the 27 member states of the EU. And there's some countries that are in one and not the other, and the other and not the one. But there's certainly some overlap, and they have some common policy interests. And so they've dovetailed their policy work and their space work in the last decade to become more parallel. One of the key projects that's joint between ESA and the EU is the navigation system Galileo. This can be thought of as an answer to GPS, but with some key differences. First of all, it's under civilian control. The US military will never turn this off. Second, it comes with a service guarantee, the idea being that it will always be there and it will always be reliable. And it does that with new and more accurate atomic clocks and better correction systems. One feature that GPS doesn't have is the ability for a SAR return signal, search and rescue return signal. The idea that if you have some emergency beacon and it's detected by the satellites, that can be relayed down to whatever search and rescue center is appropriate. But what's more, the search and rescue center can send a signal back to the poor castaway so that he knows that his signal has been received. Anyway, that stuff is supposed to be guaranteed for safety of life, so this can be used for air navigation directly without secondary services and whatnot. More accurate than GPS, 4 meters on the open service, 10 centimeters with a service guarantee on the commercial service. 2 spacecraft, the Jove A and B test spacecraft are already in orbit. This year on Soyuz from French Guiana, they're supposed to launch 4 more, and the rest of them by 2013. You might ask why to do this. Obviously, there's a utility in navigation systems, but building another one gives Europe strategic independence. What's more, it's very connected to agriculture. Europe has a large agricultural sector, but it's heavily, heavily subsidized by the EU. In fact, 2 billion of that agricultural budget was spent on this, 2 billion euros. They can use this for more precise agriculture, and they can use this to help target, to help understand who's doing how much farming where and when. Because, well, I won't talk about the complexities of how they do agricultural farming, but it has a lot to do with which part of which field is being farmed. And you need less than a meter accuracy to do that. The other key cooperation with the European Union is in Earth observation. A system called GMAS, Global Monitoring for Environment and Security. Now, Earth observation missions have happened for decades, and among them have been weather satellites. When's the last time you looked at the news and the weather picture wasn't available? Never, right? It's always there. Because those weather spacecraft are seen as being so essential that they're built, first of all, highly redundant, second, with on-orbit spares, third, with spares on the ground. And they're made in such a way that they have what's called operational level reliability. It always has to be there. That data needs to be available. This is a plan to develop an Earth observing system that will put all of the different interesting kinds of sensors in orbit with sufficient number that you can cover the whole planet every day with operational level reliability. Global monitoring for environment and for security. Anywhere on the surface of the planet, you'll know what's going on in synthetic aperture radar, which you can use for maritime surveillance and ice monitoring. You can look at ocean color, you can look at vegetation, land use, whatever else. 2 more series of satellites will look at the atmosphere. Sentinel-4 and 5 will do atmospheric dynamics and atmospheric sounding. The nice thing about this, though, is not just that there's a data set out there, not just that this is being done, but that all the data from GMAS, from the space segment that I'm describing, and from sensors on the ground, will be publicly and freely released, inside and outside of Europe. Anybody can have access to GMAS data. The first data products are already there from the precursor satellites. The idea being that this is the kind of information that you need, and that if humanity is going to work at a global level, we need the ability to understand what's going on the whole surface of the planet and to cooperate at a global level. This is a big and expensive program. Why have they chosen this? Why have they gone to the effort of funding it at $5 billion a year programs like this? Europe talks about using this to reinforce their position on the global stage, to better cooperate within Europe, and to act, they say, as a bridge builder between big and small powers. They see it as a way of facing the challenges that come against them in the future. That's from the technology side. The political side, at the European Commission, where they don't do space technology, they build policy. They talk about an increasing need for space technology to serve their policy ambitions. And they list specific things. Certainly, they're very focused on climate and weather. But at the very basic level of the things that support modern society, transportation, research, agriculture, weather, space is right there at the foundation of these things that they need, at least at the political level. Now, does the public think this? Does the public notice this? I don't know. But certainly the people who are drafting the directives and shaping the policy are expressing the ideas this way. In any case, here's one example in detail. We could go on about the space programs in Brazil, in Iran, in Japan, in Ecuador even. But the point is that there are plenty of countries who are not superpowers who are doing space programs in a whole diversity of every kind. And it's useful, actually, that way, because this gives us a sort of more robust way of ensuring that we're still doing space somewhere on this planet. This is a monument which stands in front of the United Nations office in Geneva. And it's built by the Soviet Union. There's an inscription here in Russian and French that says that it's dedicated to the success of mankind in his conquest of outer space. But we don't have the Soviet Union anymore. But it turns out we don't need the Soviet Union. There are plenty of other actors who can do this, and who are doing this, even for planetary exploration, as this crowd knows pretty well. Not only do we not need the Soviet Union today, but we never did. even a few years after they put Sputnik in orbit, other people are already doing it. So, I guess my thesis for today is just that there are other actors, that they are active, and that we can participate with them. And we can do this. We don't have to wait for the superpowers. That's my story.
Thanks, Raymond. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
Yeah.
Sure, Raymond. What's Canada's contribution to ESA, like as a member?
What's
it cost us? Yeah.
Yeah, we pay it at half the rate of a member state.
Oh, okay.
It's $20 million on the last agreement.
It's a significant fraction of the CSA's budget. And
That's what I was wondering.
I think it's more like 60 million. But now we have a disagreement, so I can't.
It was in the news a couple of weeks ago where the agreement got re-signed, and it was a $20 million contribution to that re-signed.
Okay.
I could check.
They used to take half of the overall budget for space science right away.
Yeah. And which was controversial, huh? But
yeah. So it didn't leave much behind to do anything else.
no. But you know, it allows us to participate in these programs, and certainly we've had some benefits. I mean, I got a job out of it.
Well, that's the follow-up question. So what's the multiplier effect? Has anybody calculated what comes back to us as a function of that investment? I'd put a dollar value on it.
I couldn't give you a dollar value.
Yeah.
I do know that we're entitled to geo return in proportion, and some years we have greatly exceeded our geo return because we get big contracts for things like synthetic aperture radars.
Yeah, my personal view is I think Canadian industry benefits a lot, but the science community doesn't. It probably could though, because I mean, like Raymond says, I think anytime ESA puts out an RFP on the street, Canadians can bid for it. But it's not many people do.
Working in Christie's lab, it's often easier to get SAR data from ERS or NVSat than it is from RadarSat. So
yeah,
yeah, they have a very different funding model for that stuff.
So Wikipedia says 20.5 million euro. So.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'm kind of curious about that Soyuz rocket thing. You said it's the most used rocket.
It's the one that's flown the most number of times.
So how many times roughly?
Almost 1,800 now. If you count there's a version for highly elliptical launches for Molniya. If you count that one, it's like 1,850.
So what's the next closest, do you think? A number?
I don't know.
Like 600 or?
It's a lot less. Like it's an order of magnitude. Ariane 4 flew 140 times.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
And the failure rate on the Soyuz, you said, is remarkably low.
Yep.
So what would be the next lowest? So 97% success, and then the next one would be like of the order 90% or something?
The next best rocket after that is actually Ariane 4
Okay.
with 97% success rate, but only across 140 launches. So Soyuz has held it up. And the other thing is that Soyuz has failed a lot less in the last decade than it has. 97% is an integration from like the mid-60s to the mid-2000s.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think they've only had 2 failures in the last 6 years or something.
I was kind of curious about the numbers because it's almost inappropriate to be comparing the numbers because they're like an order of magnitude off in all cases.
Absolutely, and you know what? Some of the rockets that have flown less than 100 times, there are launch vehicles that have only flown 10 or 12 times.
Failure in that case, one drops it to like 66% success rate. So
absolutely. Look at SpaceX with their privately developed rocket. It
2 for 2.
failed completely 3 times in a row, right? 0% success rate in its whole history, right? And there are some that have flown only 10 times and they got it right every time. And then Ariane 5 blew up at like 8,000 meters on its first launch, and then it was quite successful after. So yeah, it's a bit of a dice. All done? Anybody else? We can chat later if you're too shy. No, we don't have to if you're too bored.
Thanks, Raymond.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Just thought of something. So, the ESA and NASA aside, if you were to see one agency coming in as like a next superpower, right?
Okay.
What would be your speculation as to which one? Like probably the CSA, right?
Oh, of course, of course. And I'm going to look straight into the camera and hope that some of them are actually watching. But, well, you know what? You know what we don't have on this planet? We don't have a United Earth Space Probe Agency, right? There isn't a single entity that does everything, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's good that when, the first space program I ever worked on, we got right a week before CDR, and the president came and made a speech, the president of the United States came and made a speech and canceled the whole thing and said, we're moving all of the money to make a rocket to go to Mars. And I was working on a long-duration life science project, and I piped up the co-op student, precocious co-op student piped up in the meeting and said, we don't need long-duration life science to go to Mars, right? But, okay, so NASA gave up on a whole module of science experiments for the ISS and a whole bunch of stuff. But ESA didn't, right? So, if one one politician can make a decision that affects billions of dollars of investment, that's a hassle. The thing is, maybe we don't need superpowers. Maybe that's the message. Because if we put all the control in one place, then we have one person who can make a big decision and affect the whole global space environment. Now we've got this patchwork of tessellation. ESA cooperates with India, but they also cooperate with China, they also cooperate with Russia. And the little countries cooperate with whoever they want. India got its start with first the Soviet Union, but when that didn't work out, they went to the United States, and then they went to Europe, and then they said, heck with that, we're going to build our own thing. So, yeah, maybe actually diversity is the way to go. Yep.
I wonder a little bit about efficiencies, because no one spends more than the U.S. per capita by a factor of 5.
For sure. Yeah.
And so, that must give them the leeway to go and do some of these exploration initiatives that don't make as much sense in the weather satellite, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, other than...
Yeah, the Africans are not launching Voyager 5.
No.
Yeah.
So, how does that work locally? The Americans are coming down, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see much of the future for that, or will it become more based on what you can practically justify? Or is the role for that aspirational aspect?
What's interesting about, there's every one of these countries that are kind of up and coming and getting bigger, they all talk about how they're all going to go to the moon by 2020, right? Well, now we're getting a little late, so maybe 2030. But they justify things on the balance sheet in terms of the utility that they get, but they sell things to the public in terms of sending people who look like you to the moon. And even if India has not landed anybody on the moon lately, they've still been sending these Chandrayaan probes and whatnot. So there's something. With the right political structures, you can influence the way the programs work. I talked a bit about how ESA is funded, right? Space science is a mandatory program, and it includes planetary exploration. So for Europe, it's guaranteed that space science is going to get funded. And it's going to get funded for at predictable levels for 3 to 5 years on return. Now, do they have the economy of scale that the United States has to launch nuclear-powered rockets to Pluto or whatever? I don't know. But
well, don't forget that programs like ExoMars and Trace Gas Orbiter are both optional sites.
That's right.
And I'm thinking more of those, those bigger, more, I don't want to call them pie in the sky, but those kinds of programs.
Well, who is doing them? We've been talking about how we were going to have orbiting space hotels since the mid-60s. We don't have them yet.
Well, that could literally be within the next 2 years.
Yeah, and fusion is 50 years away.
The modules are built, they just need to be launched.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah. big little aerospace.
Yeah, and then the humans have to be launched at 25 million a pop.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, is anybody doing it? I don't know. But you can either have a single monolithic star fleet who's going to do it, and hope that they do, and hope that the president doesn't change his mind, and hope that the economy of that particular country doesn't collapse it. Or you can hope that having not just several players, but a diversity of players, some that are large, some that are middle, some that are big, and can, between themselves, make something work. And maybe it's less efficient, right? I mean, it's not very efficient to have people from 19 different languages talking to each other in one building. But it works. And, you know, so I don't know. When are we going to have the hotel on Mars? I believe it when I see it.
So if the U.S. and Europe, and then potentially maybe China and Russia will also want a global navigation system that their military may or may not also have access to. You foresee that becoming militarized through the back door? Because what's one of the first things you might want to knock out is somebody's going direct attacking mission, right? So
I'm not sure what you're asking.
So do you think that maybe there'll be a competition to build these satellite navigation systems, and then people looking at ways to help them?
There are all four of those entities that you've mentioned have built or are building navigation systems. The Chinese already have some of the Baidu satellites in orbit. The nice thing about putting them 20,000 kilometers up is that they're hard to reach. The Chinese and the Americans have both knocked satellites out of orbit before, and it makes a mess, but it can be done. But it's a long way to go. It's a pretty expensive thing to start taking on satellites. And Galileo, or GPS, still works if you take out one of them.
Where did you put something with radar absorbing black capability this big, just within blast radius of every single one?
Well, okay, but now you need to launch, what, 30 of those things into very high orbits?
You can stack a couple on every one.
Yes, I guess. I mean, you know, I don't know what kind of evil villain is hiding out in a Chinese mountain with signs like that.
It might be mad, actually.
But
just take a giant ray gun.
But it's, you know, like it's almost as expensive to build that kind of navigation destruction system as it is to launch the navigation system. So, you know. Anyway, if there's 3 or 4 of them out there, you can have a receiver. They already have GPS GLONASS receivers, right? Galileo is on almost the same frequency as GPS, and they're planning to sell combined receivers. So, if, you know, somebody takes out the European system, you watch the American. You know, yeah, there are ways to stop it, right? But it's pretty hard to go to 20,000 clicks up. Yeah, you could put a cannonball there.
I'm thinking nation-state actors or that backdoor weaponization space might happen.
Maybe. I mean, yeah, you could. Are you saying that you want to launch the weapons with your own satellite system to take out the opposing satellite system?
Yeah, basically.
Still have to be in a similar enough orbit. Anyway, I don't know how we're going to destroy the nav system, but let's hope it doesn't. We can do things on Earth to keep that from happening. Thanks. Go, Alex.
Okay. I just had a question about the relative benefits of having your own launch capabilities. So, like having the cost of putting up a launch pad versus the income you're going to get from hosting other countries. Like, how feasible is it?
For who and for what purpose?
Well, I guess looking at Canada and developing our own launch capacity. So now we're just working with other countries. Is that more beneficial? Like, is it just at this point in time just easier to do because there isn't much funding for the Canadian Space Agency, or is it something that would be more ideal to develop later down the line?
Each country makes a decision on that based on their political situation. Right? I mean, Iran developed their own launch capability because no one else would cooperate. Right? Europe has developed their own thing because they wanted to, but also they have this idea of guaranteed access to space. They don't want to have to bargain maybe a disfavorable way with the United States. So they have this. Now Canada, well, we have a smaller budget, right? We're like a lot smaller than some of these other places. Getting into the realm of opinion, yeah, I think certainly the Canadian industry could pull it off, given the chance and the time, right? I mean, it's been done before. It's rocket science, but it's not much more than that. The question is funding, right? If we wanted to build an Ariane 5, this took decades, right? Is it worth it? The Canadian Space Agency and Defence Research and Development Canada are currently looking at the feasibility of developing a small launch vehicle. They're looking for a niche to launch like 100 kilogram satellite, like a MOST or a NeoSat, into a sun-synchronous orbit. And they haven't put a lot of money on it so far. They're just kind of feasibility and a little bit of tech development in the hybrid rocket engine. There's a financial argument that the taxes the government would make on the launch services would pay for itself within a decade. You have to decide whether that investment is worth it, and whether politically you want to do it. Canada chose not to do launch vehicles some decades ago, partly because we didn't want to get involved with the missiles and the nuclear bomb. There's something to be said for having an independent capability to launch your own spacecraft to do Earth observation in the Arctic if you wanted to do this sovereignty thing, right? With RadarSat 2, which is our big sovereignty push for the Arctic. It sees the Arctic 14 times a day, looks through the clouds and all that. We had to pay the Russians to put it there for us. And Russians are one of our main competitors for the Arctic, right? So, yeah.
Well, the Americans wouldn't launch it, so...
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So there may be an argument for it. If I could have everything, yeah, it'd be great to have a Canadian small launch vehicle. But I wouldn't want to develop something like that at the expense of the other programs. If we had to cut back Earth observation and space science, then why would we bother developing a launch vehicle to launch nothing?
So the total budget of the CSA is just under $400 million. 375, something like that, right? What was the cost of building Vostokny? $3 billion?
Well, yeah, you really can't compare apples to apples with Russia, because their industry is very differently organized and very differently funded. Right. And they don't have to design Soyuz.
Right. They just have to build a launch facility. Now, if we're trying to become indigenously capable of launching rockets, we got to deal with not just building the rockets, but also the facilities and everything, right? So.
But that said, it's a lot cheaper to make a small launcher than a big one. Yeah. And it's a lot cheaper to make a launcher that can only do a couple of things in low Earth orbit, and to make a big...
Well, we used to launch sounding rockets from Churchill.
Yeah, and one of the proposals is, could we expand Blackbrant, the sounding rocket, to make a small payload to orbit? Yeah, I mean, they're talking a few hundreds of millions at least on a program like that over a decade.
Like the return that we get from developing something like that is fairly huge, especially now that NASA isn't launching anymore.
And there is a growing market for small satellites. We've had some success with things like MOST and SciSat, and we have new projects coming down the line, NeoSat and M3MSat, that are very small. And that, presumably, at that 50 to 100 kilogram scale, and even smaller, there's a lot of people who are launching 1 to 5 kilogram spacecraft. We have a lab in Toronto that does that. Yeah, there's lots of room for that. If we could sell nanosatellite launches cheaply, maybe we could make a real market of it and fit in. We could give you a dedicated small sat launch instead of having to get on the backside of an Indian launcher. And just take whatever orbit the prime payload wants. Yeah, there might really be an argument for it. Anyway, I think Hawes wants to go.
I got a meeting with Mike.
Okay.
Thanks again, Raymond.
Sure.